Imagine you're a scientist, carefully excavating a 3,000-year-old cave in Spain. You've been doing this for months. Dirt, rocks, more dirt, the occasional ancient pottery shard that your professor gets way too excited about. And then, out of nowhere, you pull out a sealed tube made of antler bone. Inside, human hair. And when you analyze that hair in a modern lab, you find traces of multiple powerful psychedelic compounds. You just found direct evidence that Bronze Age humans were getting absolutely cooked at their funeral ceremonies. And here's the thing, that's not even close to the beginning of the story. Because humanity's relationship with mind-altering substances doesn't start 3,000 years ago. It doesn't start 6,000 years ago. Some researchers think it might go back so far that it's woven into what we are as a species. And there's one theory so wild, so borderline insane, that mainstream scientists refuse to touch it with a 10-foot pole. While a growing number of others are quietly starting to wonder if it might actually be right. Stay with me, because we're about to go very, very deep into one of the strangest rabbit holes in all of human history. Before we even get to humans, let's take a moment to appreciate the fact that we are absolutely not alone in this. Animals get high, a lot, on purpose. Reindeer in Siberia actively seek out and eat psychedelic mushrooms, then spin around in circles, and generally act like they've had the worst possible Friday night. Elephants go out of their way to find fermented fruit and will walk ridiculous distances just to get their trunk on some rotten marula berries. Cats go feral for catnip. Wallabies in Tasmania have been documented eating opium poppies, then hopping around in circles in poppy fields. And yes, Australian farmers have actually had to report this as an agricultural problem. Actual high wallabies, destroying crops, being a menace to society. Jaguars in the Amazon eat a specific vine called yaje that triggers intense hallucinations. They've been observed doing it, wandering off and coming back looking deeply reflective. And dolphins, this one is genuinely incredible. Dolphins have been observed deliberately passing around pufferfish and chewing on them very gently, just enough to extract a small dose of the neurotoxin, which apparently produces a kind of trance-like state. They then float at the surface with their mouths open, staring at nothing, completely zoned out. Like teenagers at a music festival. These are dolphins, one of the most intelligent animals on the planet, and they found the drugfish. Researcher Ronald Siegel spent his career documenting this behavior across dozens of species and concluded that the pursuit of intoxication might actually be a fourth basic drive in animals, right alongside hunger, thirst, and reproduction. Not a quirk, not an accident, a drive. We are hardwired at a deep biological level to seek out substances that alter our brain chemistry. Which means when ancient humans stumbled across psychoactive plants, they weren't doing something unnatural. They were doing something that almost every complex organism on the planet does. They were following instinct. Very, very old instinct. Okay, so when exactly did humans start using drugs? The honest answer is we don't fully know. And the reason we don't fully know is actually fascinating in itself. Most drugs leave almost no trace in the archaeological record. Imagine trying to prove someone smoked cannabis 50,000 years ago. The plant rots, the smoke disappears. The person is long dead. Even their bones are probably dust. The only way we find evidence is if we get incredibly lucky. Residue preserved in a sealed container, traces in hair that was kept somewhere cold and dry, pollen preserved in sediment that survived by sheer geological accident. These are rare, specific, almost miraculous survivals against the crushing indifference of time. So everything we found is almost certainly just the tip of a very ancient iceberg. Every discovery of ancient drug use is really evidence of a practice that was probably already old, established, and culturally sophisticated when that evidence was created. With that caveat firmly in mind, let's look at what we actually have. The oldest direct evidence of psychoactive drug use anywhere in the world comes from Asia and dates back roughly 4,600 years. We have chemical traces of cannabis found in wooden burning bowls in ancient China and Central Asia, clearly being used in ritual contexts associated with burial sites. And here's the detail that makes this even more vivid. Archaeologists found a harp at the same site. So these people were burning cannabis, playing music, and presumably weeping at a funeral while also experiencing a mild but noticeable alteration of consciousness, which honestly sounds better than most funerals today. More honest, at minimum. In Europe, that same Spanish cave I mentioned at the start, Escarix on the island of Minorca gives us the oldest direct chemical evidence on the continent. 3,000 years ago, someone who was probably a shaman was regularly consuming a cocktail of substances derived from nightshade plants: ephedrine, atropine, and scopolamine. These are not gentle compounds. Scopolamine causes powerful hallucinations and what ancient accounts often describe as out-of-body experiences. Atropine can induce full-blown delirium. These people weren't microdosing with a cup of chamomile tea. They were going completely off the deep end, and they were doing it on purpose, in service of a ritual function their community depended on. The hair analysis showed they weren't doing this once as some kind of wild experiment. They were doing it regularly over at least a year. This was a practice, a discipline, a profession, maybe. In the Americas, peyote cactus buttons have been carbon dated to around 4000 BC. That's 6,000 years ago. And the mushroom statues and carvings found across Mexico suggest psilocybe use was established there at least 2,500 years ago, though the real dates are almost certainly much older. Indigenous oral traditions suggest these practices stretch back into a time before any written record exists. In South America, you have evidence for ayahuasca, the legendary jungle brew made from two separate plants that somehow have to be combined to produce their effect, appearing in ritual bundles dating back over 1,000 years. The fact that someone figured out in the depths of the Amazon rainforest that you need to combine a specific vine and a specific leaf in a specific preparation to unlock this experience is one of the most confounding mysteries in ethnobotany. Indigenous people say the plants themselves told them. Scientists say that's not an explanation, and yet nobody has a better one. Globally, we have documented evidence of drug use stretching back at least 6,000 years across multiple continents, multiple cultures, and substances that vary wildly depending on what grew locally. This wasn't a regional quirk or cultural accident. This was universal. Everywhere humans went, they found the psychoactive plants, and they used them. Here's something that stops most people cold when they first really sit with it. Almost every single piece of ancient evidence we have for drug use isn't recreational. It's religious. The cannabis in China, burned at a funeral to communicate with the dead. The peyote in North America, used exclusively in sacred ceremonies. The nightshade cocktail in Spain, consumed by what appears to be a ritual specialist, a mediator between the living and whatever came after. The psychedelic mushrooms in Mesoamerica, depicted alongside gods, used in ceremonies for divine communication and prophecy. Across cultures that never met each other, never traded ideas, never shared a single word of language, the pattern is strikingly, almost impossibly identical. You take a substance, you enter an altered state, and in that altered state, you believe you are crossing a threshold. You're communing with ancestors. You're receiving messages from beyond. You're seeing the structure of reality in a way your ordinary mind cannot access. You can be a strict rationalist and say, obviously these people were just experiencing neurologically induced hallucinations and interpreting brain activity as spiritual contact. That's a valid position. But here's the more uncomfortable observation. How did all these completely separate civilizations independently arrive at the exact same ritual framework? How did people in the Amazon and people in the Mediterranean and people in Central Asia all independently decide that the right way to contact the divine was through a specific plant-induced altered state? Why not through fasting alone, or pain, or music, or dancing? All of which were also used, but the plant element keeps appearing, independently, everywhere. Some anthropologists now think that psychedelics might actually be the origin point of religion, not metaphorically, literally. The idea that there is something beyond ordinary reality, ancestors, spirits, gods, and afterlife, might have first crystallized in human culture through psychedelic experiences. When a Paleolithic shaman consumed a mushroom and encountered something that felt more real than reality, more present than any waking experience ever had, and then returned to their community and tried to describe what they had seen. That might have been the first time a human being said, with genuine conviction, there is another world, which is either the most profound thing you've heard today or the most unsettling, depending on where you like your worldview. We've been focused on psychedelics, but we need to address the elephant in the room, or rather, the elephant that's been stumbling around the room looking for more fermented marula fruit. Alcohol, the world's most widely used drug, the one that's somehow socially acceptable to consume before noon if you're at a brunch, and which gets its own dedicated aisle in every supermarket, and which ancient civilizations treated with the same reverence they gave to their gods. When did humans start drinking? Chemical evidence from an ancient site in China called Jiahu shows that humans were brewing a fermented mixture of rice, honey, and fruit as far back as 9,000 years ago. That is genuinely extraordinary. That is before writing, before widespread agriculture, before cities. Humans were deliberately fermenting beverages before they had invented most of the other things we associate with civilization. The oldest known brewery in the world, found at a site called Rakafet Cave in Israel, pushes that back even further, to 13,000 years ago. Natufian hunter-gatherers, people who had not yet settled into permanent agricultural communities, were already brewing and consuming fermented grain beverages. They were doing it in caves. They were nomadic brewers. And this brings us to one of the most genuinely contested debates in archaeology, the beer before bread hypothesis. The idea, proposed seriously by a number of researchers, is that humans didn't begin the long, labor-intensive process of cultivating grain primarily to make food. They did it, at least in significant part, to make beer. That the world's first farmers might have been motivated by the desire for a reliable, sustainable supply of fermented grain drinks. Most archaeologists consider this an overstatement. You need bread to survive, and beer is, technically, optional. But the debate itself reveals something important. That from the very beginning, the production of intoxicants was not separate from the development of civilization. It was woven into it. It drove agricultural innovation, trade networks, social rituals. You cannot tell the history of beer without telling the history of humanity, because they have been advancing in lockstep since before recorded history began. There is a hypothesis, but not a proven theory. Let's be absolutely clear about that. A hypothesis so provocative and so strange that mentioning it at the wrong academic conference can genuinely end conversations. It's called the stoned ape hypothesis. It was proposed by the ethnobotanist and writer Terence McKenna in 1992. In his book Food of the Gods, and it goes like this. Around 2 million years ago, our hominid ancestors were living on the African savanna, following herds of large grazing animals. And where there are large grazing animals, there is dung. And growing in that dung across the African grasslands are psilocybe mushrooms, magic mushrooms. The ones with the smiley faces on the packets in Amsterdam, if you're from Europe, and you know what I'm referring to. McKenna proposed that early humans began eating these mushrooms, either by accident while foraging, or by observing other animals consuming them, and that the cognitive effects of psilocybin, experienced repeatedly over generations, catalyzed a dramatic acceleration in brain development. Enhanced visual acuity at lower doses, better pattern recognition, increased creative and associative thinking, greater empathy and social bonding, and eventually perhaps the emergence of language itself, the ability to take an experience and encode it symbolically for another person. His argument was that the leap from Homo erectus to Homo sapiens, a doubling of brain size in what is, evolutionarily speaking, a fairly compressed time frame, might have been triggered, at least in part, by regular exposure to a genuinely powerful cognitive enhancer. In other words, we became human because our ancestors ate mushrooms growing in cow manure. Sit with that for a second. This is obviously an extraordinary claim. Most mainstream evolutionary biologists have significant issues with the mechanisms McKenna proposed. You can't biologically inherit the cognitive experience of a drug trip. That's not how genetics works. The timeline is fuzzy. There's no direct fossil evidence. The hypothesis is classified as exactly that, a hypothesis, and not a particularly well-supported one by scientific standards. And yet, some parts of this don't go away as easily as critics would like. Psilocybin is a documented psychoplastogen, a compound that literally stimulates neuroplastic changes in the brain. It promotes the growth of new neural connections. Modern neuroscience has measured this. It increases cognitive flexibility in ways that last well beyond the acute experience. These effects are real and reproducible in laboratory settings. Mycologist Paul Stamets, one of the most respected fungi researchers alive, has stated publicly that he finds the core of the hypothesis compelling, not necessarily in the exact form McKenna presented, but in the broader sense that the relationship between psychedelic fungi and early human cognitive development might be more significant than mainstream science acknowledges. Researchers working at the frontier of epigenetic inheritance, the study of how acquired traits can sometimes be chemically transmitted across generations, have suggested that some of the mechanisms aren't as scientifically impossible as they initially appeared. Is the stoned ape hypothesis correct? Probably not in the specific way McKenna described it. But does it point at something real? The idea that psychoactive plants played a meaningful role in shaping human consciousness, culture, and possibly even development? That question is increasingly hard to dismiss entirely, and there's a reason it refuses to die. Because if it's true, even partially, it's the most darkly funny origin story in existence. The apex predator of the planet. The species that split the atom, composed symphonies, built cathedrals and stock markets and the internet, because some early hominid ate a mushroom out of a pile of dung on the African savanna and had a very good time. Let's step back from the theoretical and paint an actual, vivid picture of what ancient drug culture looked like on the ground. Because it was almost nothing like what most modern people imagine. The recreational drug culture we know today, casual, private, largely individual, pursued for enjoyment, is genuinely quite recent in human history. For most of our past, psychoactive substances were controlled, ritualized, treated with profound respect, and often restricted to specific specialists or occasions. They weren't something you did on a Tuesday because you were bored. In ancient Mesopotamia, opium was documented medicinally and ritually at least 5,000 years ago. The Sumerians referred to the poppy as hulgil, the joy plant, and were actively cultivating it by at least 3,400 BC. Some historians argue that what we can identify as the world's earliest written prescription involves opium as a primary component. The oldest healthcare document in existence is essentially a drug reference. In ancient Egypt, there is material evidence of cannabis, blue water lotus, and potentially other psychoactive plants appearing in religious and funerary contexts. The blue lotus is particularly compelling. It's depicted obsessively across thousands of years of Egyptian art, on temple walls, in papyri, in tomb paintings. Some Egyptologists have proposed it was soaked in wine or another fermented liquid to extract its mildly psychoactive compounds. The sheer repetition of the motif suggests the Egyptians were either very aesthetically attached to this particular flower, or they had extremely good reasons to keep it at the forefront of their cultural iconography. And then there are the Eleusinian Mysteries, one of the most important religious institutions in the entire ancient world, practiced continuously for nearly 2,000 years. Every year, thousands of Greeks made a pilgrimage to the city of Eleusis to participate in a ritual that climaxed in the drinking of a substance called the kykeon, followed by an experience that initiates described, consistently, across centuries, in nearly identical terms. Dissolution of the self, encounters with the dead, visions of reality that felt more fundamentally true than anything accessible in ordinary waking life. The mysteries were so sacred that revealing what occurred inside was punishable by death. Not a fine. Death. And yet we know that Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Marcus Aurelius, Sophocles, many of the most towering intellectual figures of the ancient world were initiates. These were not credulous peasants. These were the most sophisticated thinkers of their time. And they went to Eleusis, they drank the kykeon, and they came back changed. In 2020, researchers analyzed residue found in a drinking cup at an ancient Greek site in Spain. The residue contained ergot, a fungus that grows on grain and contains compounds that are chemical precursors to LSD. The kykeon was, in all likelihood, psychoactive. The philosophical and spiritual foundations of Western civilization were, at least in part, constructed in altered states of consciousness. That's not a metaphor. That is a chemical finding from a goblet. The human brain in 3000 BC was biologically identical to yours. Same neural architecture, same capacity for fear, wonder, love, grief, and creative thought. The shaman consuming nightshade alkaloids in a sealed Spanish cave. The Greek initiate drinking the kykeon, the Natufian brewer making the world's first beer in a cave in Israel, these were not primitive people with primitive minds. They were fully modern human beings who happened to be born before industrialization, and they built extraordinarily sophisticated systems of knowledge around consciousness and the plants that could alter it. They cataloged effects. They developed preparation methods that took generations to refine. They created ritual containers, ceremonies, traditions, rules that made powerful experiences meaningful, navigable, and transmissible across time. They had pharmacologists, psychologists, and therapists thousands of years before those words existed. Modern clinical research is currently in the middle of a slow motion rediscovery of what these people already knew. Controlled trials show that psilocybin produces profound and lasting shifts in outlook for people with treatment resistant depression. MDMA assisted therapy is showing remarkable results for PTSD where nothing else worked. Ketamine interrupts suicidal ideation in ways that continue to surprise clinicians. These are not fringe results. These are peer-reviewed findings from major research institutions. We spent several hundred years dismissing the accumulated pharmacological knowledge of ancient cultures as superstition, burning it, colonizing it out of existence. And we are now spending billions of dollars in laboratory settings to arrive, carefully and expensively, back at similar conclusions. So, when did ancient humans start taking drugs? The real answer: before we have evidence of it, and probably before we have the capacity to find evidence of it. Every decade, the timeline shifts further back. Researchers who specialize in this field say the same thing without exception. We will always find older evidence because the practice is older than our ability to detect it. What we can say is this: the desire to alter consciousness is not a modern failure or a cultural malfunction. It is one of the most ancient, universal, and deeply documented behaviors in human history. Every civilization on every continent found the plants, the fungi, the fermented drinks available in their specific corner of the world, and almost all of them, independently, concluded that these substances were not just useful. They were sacred. They built temples around them, priesthoods to steward them, rituals to make them meaningful and transmissible. They used them to grieve, to celebrate, to heal, to understand the cosmos, to cross whatever boundary they believed separated the living from the dead. And somewhere in that 13,000-year-old brewery in Rakafet Cave, some Natufian person lifted the world's first cup of deliberately fermented grain liquid, took a cautious sip, felt it hit, and had the exact same thought that has occurred to billions of people in the millennia since. Oh, that's something. The rest, in every sense of the word, is history.